Hello, ECSA and Security Plus. Hello, my name is Sasha, and I'll be your guide throughout this course. Like you, I have been hearing the word cybersecurity a lot lately, and I discovered there is a lot to learn about the subject. As you know, the world of information technology is constantly changing to adapt to our needs as organizations and individuals, as well as responding to security threats. Today, we are using sophisticated communication systems to share information like never before. We're able to transmit and process information amazingly quickly, such that the volume of data that is exchanged and stored has increased tremendously in the last few years. All this data, some of it extremely sensitive, is at risk and needs to be protected. This is where cybersecurity plays a crucial role. In this course, you will discover the importance of cybersecurity and information technology. The objective is to understand cyber attacks and the techniques used to take control of an unsecure system. The course also presents the defensive measures security teams can take to prevent attacks and provides an overview of the malicious software types used in computer networks. Throughout this course, you will view engaging videos, watch interesting demonstrations, and complete challenges related to security, networking basics, discovery and attack vectors, vulnerabilities and system scanning, system exploitation, and malware. Your guide during your journey will be James Michael Stewart. Michael has been working with computers and technology for over 30 years. His work focuses on security, certification, and various operating systems. Michael has been teaching job skill and certification courses for over 20 years, such as CISSP, ethical hacking penetration testing, computer forensics, and Security Plus. He is the primary author on the books CISSP Study Guide 7th edition and Security Plus Review Guide 4th edition, focusing on the SY0501 version of the exam. Michael holds a variety of certifications, including CISSP, CEH, CHFI, ECSA, and Security Plus. I will check in with you at the beginning of each challenge and at the end of each module. For now, you're in great hands with Michael.
So what is security? Well, in technology, security is the state in which information resides. It's a means by which we can provide protection for the data that we have and our ability to perform work tasks. Now, you can't see security, but we can implement it by using a variety of steps, practices, and written documentation on how to accomplish various work tasks. And you can accomplish security both at home as well as work. And we need to consider that security is important everywhere that data exists. Now, a key and foundational concept of security is the Cia Triad. This refers to three main security services which every organization needs to focus on. The first one is confidentiality. Confidentiality is the protection against unauthorized disclosure, whether that be to insiders who are currently employees or outsiders. We want to make sure that only those who have correct and valid reasons to access a resource can actually do so. Now, while we want to think about the defense part of confidentiality, you also must think about the allow portion of confidentiality, which is you also want to make sure that authorized personnel can gain access to resources when they actually need them. The second of the Cia Triad is the integrity concept. Integrity is the protection against unauthorized change. Now, changes may be accidental, as caused by, say, employees, or can be intentionally malicious when caused by an outside attacker. We want to prevent such unauthorized changes while allowing for authorized change when necessary. And the third element of the Cia Triad is that of availability. Availability is the protection that you have the ability to access your resources at a reasonable time frame, throughput, and response rate. This means you're protecting against denial of service while protecting the ability to perform work tasks. So there's some essential security terminology that you need to be familiar with. First off, let's talk about the idea of a threat. A threat is something that can cause harm. So you can think of threat like a weapon and anything that may cause harm. This can include malicious code. This can include a Mother Nature event. This can include the actions of a criminal attacker, maybe using a buffer overflow attack against your organization. So a threat is anything that can cause you harm. Next is a vulnerability. A vulnerability is a weakness or a lack of protection. If your assets have a vulnerability, then they have the potential of being harmed by a threat. An attack is when a threat is used to cause harm because your assets have a vulnerability. Someone, maybe we call this person an attacker, although you could also classify them as a threat agent, would then take the threat, the weapon, and cause you harm because your assets have weaknesses. Now, sometimes these threats are known as exploits. Usually an exploit is a type of software code that's been written to specifically take advantage of a known vulnerability or flaw in software code, which could be applications, operating systems, or even the firmware on certain devices. Ultimately, by knowing that there are threats in existence, that we have vulnerabilities on our assets, and potentially there are exploits that an attacker can use against us, we can be aware of our level of risk. Once we have that knowledge, we can then begin making decisions on picking countermeasures, safeguards, or defenses that can help prevent such harm from being caused. We can call these controls or security controls, which are going to defend against the threats becoming real or threats causing us harm against our actual assets. So here are some important terms to be familiar with. Again, threat, vulnerability, attack, exploit, and then the idea of control or countermeasure. Let's continue discussing some of the security terminology you want to know. So leading on from the Cia Triad, let's talk about AAA services. Now, AAA services is an important security concept because it allows us to enforce the protections of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, you would think with AAA services it'd be comprised of 3 items starting with letter A, but in fact, it's 5 items, and one of them doesn't start with letter A. So these 5 items are identification, authentication, authorization, auditing, and accountability. Let's talk about what each of these is briefly. First, identification is the claiming of an identity, and most of us will type in a username to do this. Authentication is proving that you are the claimed identity, and very commonly we use passwords to perform authentication. Once we've logged in, authorization controls what we can do. We can also call this access control. Auditing is the recording of the events that take place on the system. And finally, accountability is reviewing those audit logs to look for compliance or violations. So AAA services is an important concept that you want to be familiar with. There are many different types of countermeasures in terms of their function or their purpose. Let's talk about 3 of those. First off, let's talk about preventative. Preventative controls are those that try to make the unwanted event not possible to be performed. Think of them kind of like a brick wall, which may prevent someone from getting past a certain point that you want to prevent unauthorized access. Other examples include firewalls, physical locks on doors, even access controls can be used as a preventative control. It prevents the unwanted activity from actually being able to occur. But we have to keep in mind that there are no preventative controls that are perfect. In fact, every single security control can be gotten around in some way because they either have a maximum value, they only perform functions to a certain point, they have a flaw or a workaround, or a complete bypass may be available. So we often combine multiple controls into one collection for defense in-depth operations for security. Now, the second main type of control we're going to look at is called the deterrent. A deterrent is a control that tries to not allow the activity to occur, but this time it's through trying to convince the perpetrator to choose not to perform the unwanted action. This can be signs that may say unauthorized access prohibited or video surveillance is in use. This can be the instructions you would find in a security policy. This can also be the use of things like barbed wire and machine gun embankments and guard dogs, which might in some cases cause physical harm. Those are also deterrents. Again, the goal of a deterrent control is to convince someone to choose not to perform the violation. And the third type of control is that of detective. A detective control is one where we're trying to detect the violations, and when they're attempted, we want to be aware of it. Whether they're attempted and they fail, or they're attempted and they succeed, we still want to know about both of those. So concepts like auditing, logging, and monitoring on a computer system, as well as having things such as video camera control, security guards, are also great things for physical world detection. So a combination of the preventative controls, deterrent controls, and detective controls are often needed to perform a reliable defense in depth structure for your security environment. A risk is the assessment of the likelihood or probability of a threat causing your assets harm. The idea of risk management is the concept of being able to evaluate the risks that your company is facing and then making informed decisions on implementing proper countermeasures. Risk assessment is an essential part of security management for any organization. You have to understand what assets you have, what vulnerabilities those assets happen to have, the threats that exist that could cause them harm, and the countermeasures that are present or available that you can use to help reduce your risk in some reasonable manner. So first off, in our risk concept, we look at identifying our threats. Now, threats can come from inside or outside the organization. They could be man-made, they could be accidental, they could be Mother Nature, and almost anything you can conceive of may cause some harm. This can include accidents by your employees. This can include malicious code written by some unknown attacker. This could be a fire in the building. This could be an exploiter who's on the outside who wants to somehow cause your company harm. So we have to first inventory the threats to understand what those are. Next, what is the probability and impact of those threats becoming real? We have to know how often it may be possible for those threats to give us harm. And then if we are harmed by them, how much harm would that be? Now, in some formal environments, you would perform a type of risk evaluation known as quantitative analysis. And these two values here have their own labeling. One of them is called the exposure factor, commonly referred to as EF, which is how much of a percentage of asset value could you lose. And the next one, probability, is taken under account of a concept called the annualized rate of occurrence, the ARO, which is how many times in a given year is it possible for a risk to actually come into existence and cause you harm. We then look at our controls, what security measures, what safeguards, what things we can implement that may be able to defend ourselves against a known identified risk or threat. Now, often we think that we can install a product, buy something new, a new firewall, a new encryption suite, a new antivirus product, and that may be the case. But it's important not to limit our thinking to only just buying new products as countermeasures. It's also a valid countermeasure to remove an item that you don't necessarily need in the organization, or to change a business function, or adjust configuration, or just simply perform an action that avoids the risky activity itself. Now, it is important to realize that it's not possible to eliminate all possible risks. You may be able to eliminate some risks, but not all of them. Generally, we're focusing on risk mitigation, which you think of as risk reduction. Sometimes risks are eliminated, but most of the time they're just simply reduced to a lower level. What we want at the end is for risk to be at an acceptable or tolerable level, a level that we no longer see a benefit to assigning a new countermeasure to, because the cost of the countermeasure versus the benefit of that countermeasure isn't significant enough to be worthwhile implementing it. It is costly to implement security, but it's more likely more costly not to implement proper security. And so we want our security to be cost effective. We do have to evaluate how much things cost in terms of leaving a threat unprotected versus how much the countermeasure and the safeguard and the response would cost us, not only for implementation, but also long-term maintenance and user training and adjusting user behavior activities. And if we see that the cost of the countermeasure is less than the cost of the risk of not protecting or the cost of an actual compromise, it's usually cost-effective to implement the security. And then finally, what is our risk tolerance? At what level can risk be accepted as is? Generally, that's a level where the available countermeasures are more costly and more inconvenient than the benefit we gain from them. And that if an unprotected risk actually comes to fruition and causes us harm, we perceive that that harm would be less costly than having put in a countermeasure. And in that point, the risk is considered tolerable or acceptable. But there's usually one more small piece to this, and that is we have to be careful not to be found to have ignored risk. Ignoring risk looks very much like accepting risk. It shows the company not having put in any countermeasures. But there's a clear difference. The difference is with an accepted risk, there's a document written that explains the risk, how it was evaluated, the countermeasures that were considered, and this document is signed off on by senior management. And thus, if there's ever a legal issue about whether or not you had a legal recognized obligation to perform certain security, if you can show that you had accepted risk, then you will likely not be found negligent for losses and compromise as compared to if you had ignored the risk, then you may be found negligent. So risk is about evaluating your assets, knowing the threats, and taking the proper responses based upon a calculated level of risk and risk acceptance. So let's talk about the idea of risk management strategies. So a risk management strategy is your selected response to the risks that you've identified. Whether that risk be a risk from an employee, risk from a technology we deployed, risk of software you did not program, risk of an outside attacker, you have to come up with a response to each and every risk you've identified. And there are several different ways you can respond. First one is commonly known as risk mitigation. To risk mitigate is to simply address the risk head on. You may buy a new product, you might address the item by adjusting existing product, you might change configuration, modify business tasks. The goal here is to reduce or eliminate the risk when possible. Now again, most of the time you cannot eliminate a risk. Generally, if you're going to eliminate a risk, you have to eliminate an item. Let me give you a brief example of that. Let's say the risk is the idea of war dialing. That's when someone can dial phone numbers looking for active modems. Well, there it is. If you have an active modem and you don't need it any longer for a business task, by removing the modem from your environment, you've removed that risk entirely. So it's always worth considering whether removing of something is going to be more beneficial than adding in some new defense, because it may only reduce the risk rather than eliminating it. But again, not all risks can you fully eliminate. Most risks you can only reduce. Installing a firewall, installing antivirus monitoring, installing intrusion detection systems, putting in stronger authorization, authentication, or encryption. All of these are great products, but most of the time they just reduce the risk. They don't eliminate it completely. But we have a few other strategies to respond as well. We can also go the route of risk acceptance or risk tolerance. This is the risk that you decide to leave unchanged because we believe that the countermeasure isn't worth the benefit, because it's either too costly, not compatible, just not effective, and the risk of the actual harm caused, if the risk is ever realized, is small in comparison. Now, generally, we do have to document accepted risk so that we aren't potentially found to have ignored risk, but this usually is not that complicated of a task. Write it out on paper and have a senior management official sign off on it. A third potential of risk strategy is that of risk transference. You can also call this risk assignment. This is when I put the risk on someone else's shoulders. Some easy examples of that would be to buy insurance, and yes, there is now hacker insurance you can purchase, compromise insurance that will pay you money, potentially, if you're hit by a certain type of compromise or breach by a cyber attack. But then a second concept would be outsourcing. If there's a certain aspect of your business you can outsource to another company, maybe they can take on some or all of the risk related to that portion of the company that you put on their shoulders. Maybe that's tech support. Maybe that is accounting services. That may be a place worth considering. And a third interesting strategy is risk rejection. This is the idea that I understand the risk is present. I don't want the risk around. I'm going to change my environment to get rid of it. Now, I mentioned this one earlier in our risk mitigation. This is when I eliminate something completely to get rid of it entirely. This is always a response I can choose. Now, I have to make sure that if I'm going to reject a risk and remove an object from my organization, I don't need it for a business task. But then again, I should only be keeping around those things, those assets, which are needed at a business task in the first place. So typically, this last item is something I don't often get a choice to have because I've already gotten rid of anything I don't actually need. But these are the main risk response strategies. Again, those are risk mitigation or risk reduction, acceptance or tolerance, and then transference or assignment. Securing networks and computers is no easy task. We've mentioned risk exists, and another factor or reason why it is a challenge is usability. So let's compare those two. If this is a graph comparing security to usability, we can compare this between levels of low and high security levels, between low and high usability levels. And the relationship is inverted. When there's high usability, there's often low security, but when there's low usability, we likely have high security. The more a system is open, the more function that it has, the more it integrates, the more difficult it is to secure. Likewise, the less usability there is, the easier it is to secure, and thus the more security you would have. Obviously, there's a balance that we need to find between usability and security. Finding that balance can be a challenge, since every organization has its own security tolerance levels. The more a system is usable, the less it is secure. The more a system is secure, the less it is usable. So there's an inverse relationship here. Now let's talk about a few common examples of situations where establishing this balance may be difficult. Let's say an organization is using an application for the core of their business, but the application requires many ports to be open across the firewall that exposes the company to the internet. Opening many ports can lead to greater exposure of the system for network mapping, port scanning, and other types of vulnerability scanning attacks. Now, employees could also say be using a USB device to share data within the small company. Although it's easier to share data that way, the device can be stolen, therefore exposing potential information to restricted use from the company to the outside world. And again, this is another problem. Therefore, as the usability goes up, security is often lessened. So in these cases, multiple solutions aimed at improving the level of security can be upgraded, such as controls and countermeasures. But the more we keep the system open, the higher the probability is that our vulnerability will be found and will be used against us. So the next topic is networking basics. And to better understand how security is integrated into our networks, the first step is to have an understanding of the information flow. And we'll take a look at that by looking at how our protocols operate. Now, there are many types of attacks and defense systems we have to also worry about, and information flow can help you understand where there are weaknesses and where there are vulnerabilities that must be addressed. This is often a very good place to start when looking into a cybersecurity violation. We'll also take a look at a few other core networking components before we move on to other exploitation concepts. Let's talk about information flow models. These are sometimes also known as protocol stack models. They are systems that describe how protocols work. Now, a protocol is a system of rules that dictate how computers can send and receive information over network connections. Back in the early 70s, the concept known as the OSI model, the Open Systems Interconnect model, was created. And this model has 7 layers and describes the general idea about how protocols often work. Now, this one model was not formulated after a single protocol, but of an amalgamation of all the protocols available at that time. Now, you'll notice here we also have a listing of a model called the Tcp Ip model, although it's also sometimes known as the DoD model for the Department of Defense, or the program where this came from, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency model, so TCP IP model, DoD model, or DARPA model, and it only has 4 layers, because this model is crafted directly from the TCP IP protocol stack we still use today. Now, this particular presentation here shows you a comparison between the 7 layers of OSI and the 4 layers of the TCP IP model. And as you can see, they roughly do kind of line up. Kind of line up is really the core item there. They're not exactly the same. And that's because the OSI 7-layer model is a general description of how protocols could work in theory, but it doesn't describe how any one works actually. While TCP IP is a direct model derived from an actual protocol. Therefore, it's a bit more exact. The relationships, as you can see, at the bottom of TCP IP does relate to the bottom 2 of OSI. The second of TCP IP relates to the third of OSI. The third of TCP IP relates to the fourth of OSI. And finally, the fourth and top item of TCP IP relates to the top 3 of OSI. Now, let's talk a little bit about what these layers are named and what they do. At the bottom of the OSI, we have the first of the 7 layers. The bottom is called the physical layer. This is the direct physical interface between the software protocol stack and the physical network itself. The data link layer is the first of the logical layers that defines concepts like addressing. Often here we have the protocol known as Ethernet. Above that, we have the network layer, another layer of logical addressing, and most of the time here today we use the IP protocol from the TCP IP protocol stack. The network layer is used to make sure that we can have a ever-expanding size of network by using an addressing scheme. These days, that's IP addressing. That's comprised of both a network portion, also known as the subnet ID, and a host portion, or the individual device's identification. The transport layer is then the layer where we begin to manage communications as either being connection-oriented. That means to ensure that every packet is sent and received successfully, versus connection-less, where we don't necessarily concern ourselves with whether or not a packet gets delivered successfully or not. The session layer was designed to be more specific about management of sessions, error correction, error retransmission, those kinds of things. Layer 6, the presentation layer, was initially designed as a place where we might reformat data for network transmission. It turns out we don't need to do that. Where we may do compression to speed up communications, and we do some compression today, but typically only related to encryption. And then the third major thing that presentation layer is supposed to bring to us was encryption. And we do a lot of encryption on today's protocol stacks. It just turns out we don't do any of it at the presentation layer. So while we see related to the TCP IP stack, we do kind of claim that the top layer 4 of the TCP IP model relates to include this layer 6 presentation from OSI. We don't really include it there at all. Let's briefly mention how we can use encryption in several places. We can encrypt above the OSI layer. The application itself can pre-encrypt. You might consider this pre-network encryption. We can also encrypt at the transport layer with a protocol today we know as Transport Layer Security, which used to be known as SSL. We also can use VPN encryption, which depending upon the VPN protocol in use, can relate between layers 2, 3, or 4. We can do encryption at the physical layer. This is generally going to be related to Wi-Fi. Although even with Wi-Fi encryption, we don't quite have every single thing encrypted. Even with the best Wi-Fi encryption we use today, there's still likely plain text Ethernet headers. And there's one last and final type of encryption, which is called bulk encryption, which is when we encrypt directly on the network cable coming out of a network interface card. Now, the 7th layer of the OSI is the application layer. And this is the interface between the software stack of the protocol, the network itself, with the software of the local computer system. Now, this software can be a client utility, like an email client, or it could be a server application, like the Exchange server that receives and sends email for you in bulk. Now, over on the TCP IP side, the TCP IP protocol stack, the protocol layer model, we see there are 4 main layers. And notice that there are 2 different terms, 2 different words or phrases to describe each layer. And that's because there were some original terms used when this was first defined, but over the years, we've adopted other terms, either because they're more accurate, easier to say, or we borrowed names from OSI for convenience. At the bottom of layer 1, the network layer, was originally called the network interface layer, although today we normally just call it the link layer. Layer 2 of the TCP IP model was originally known as the internetworking layer, although now today it's just normally called the internetwork layer. It's also important to realize that when we say internet here, we do not mean the worldwide internet. Instead, this means the interconnection between devices. Layer 3 was originally known as the host-to-host layer, and now it's known as the transport layer, to borrow the name from the OSI model. And then finally, we have the top layer, which was originally called the process layer, although normally today called the application layer, to yet again borrow the name from OSI. You also notice that generally here, from about the middle point of these protocol stacks and up, focuses more on software control, software management, and software management, where the ones below focus more on hardware focus of hardware management, hardware activity. And so these two models, these two layers, concepts are regularly used to describe how protocols operate. However, anytime we mention a layer by name or by number, especially when we use the OSI layer's names, we are typically referring to the OSI model. Even though it's less specific and it's less accurate, it's the standard convention of reference. The only time we ever really talk about the TCP IP model is when we call it out specifically, which does not occur that frequently these days. So do keep in mind there are two main ideas of information flow. There's the OSI model, the generic idea about how things could work, and the specific model of TCP IP, which was derived directly from that particular protocol. So let's explore just a little bit more about some core networking terminology. So first off, we have the idea of a node. A node is any device on the network. If it has a network interface plugged into it, then it is a node on the network. Now within the area of nodes, we have lots of other devices. One type of common device is that of a server, some type of machine that we will use to provide resources to other systems. And then we have clients. Clients are typically less powerful machines that are designed to be used by individual workers to access the resources on the servers. Now, both clients and servers will run various applications. A client-side application will be used to reach out to the resources on a server, while the server will run network applications, those that are able to handle multiple simultaneous queries and data requests from individual clients. Now, the way servers and clients can communicate is over a network. This will be a series of cables that interconnect the devices across the network management devices, of which we'll talk about several of those in a few minutes. Now, over the network itself, we have protocols. Today, the dominant protocol that we use is the TCP IP protocol, named after the two dominant protocols in the stack: Transmission Control Protocol, which operates at layer 4 of the OSI model, the transport layer, and the Internet Protocol, which operates at layer 3 of the OSI model, known as the network layer. Now let's take a look at a pretty common example of a TCP IP packet or network container that may traverse your network. And let's say this happens to be a web-based communication. What we're talking about here is a concept known as network encapsulation. So if this represents my entire communication, I'm going to have initially a header that is crafted by Ethernet, which exists at layer 2, the data link layer. We'll then have a header that is from IP, Internet Protocol, and this exists at layer 3. Following that, we have the TCP protocol, although we could have had UDP here for other types of communications, but my example, I'm going to stay with TCP. That's at layer 4. And then we have our application layer protocol, which for the web would likely be HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which we can label as a layer 7 protocol. And then there's the payload of HTTP, which would be carried along by this overall communication. Now, each of these headers, or at least most of these headers, do have some type of addressing scheme involved. The Ethernet section, for example, uses MAC addresses. So a MAC address, a media access controller address, is a 48-bit number. Now the MAC address is actually two parts. The first half, the first 24 bits, are known as the Organizationally Unique Identifier, the OUI. You can think of this like the vendor ID. These are assigned by the group known as IEEE, and each one of the OUIs is assigned to a unique vendor. And then the second half, the second 24 bits, are crafted by the vendor themselves. Sometimes they're picked somewhat at random, other times they're used to describe and define the make and model of the particular network interface card. Now above the MAC address, which operates at layer 2, we have the IP operating at layer 3, and we have the IP address. Now specifically for IP version 4, we end up having a 32-bit address, which is often written not in its original binary, which the computer uses, but in a form that is a bit more human-friendly. This is known as the dotted decimal notation. One example could be 172.16.5.111. That could potentially be an IP address of a machine inside your private network. And then up at layer 4, the transport layer, we have one more type of addressing scheme, and that is called a port. Now, the port numbers can be the numbers between 0 and 65,535, meaning there's a total of 65,536 possible ports. And these are the port numbers for both TCP and UDP. The combination of both an IP address and a port number is known as a socket, and it's a common way to refer to the connection that exists on both sides of a TCP or UDP communication. Now let's go back and talk about the network management devices. So a network management device is what connects the servers and clients together, and it supports and manages their communication. Most networks today are based around a concept called a switch. Now, a switch is a device that is able to manage communications by taking note of the MAC addresses that are in use. A switch operates at layer 2, that means the data link layer of the OSI stack, and therefore focuses on MAC addresses for network management. Now, the way it does this is it has 4 functions. These can be known as learn or learning mode, where it will look at the source MAC address of each Ethernet frame that happens to come into one of its interfaces, and then adds that MAC address to a list in memory of the MAC address itself and what physical port it showed up on. Then, when future communications are received, the destination MAC address is compared to that lookup table. And if the destination is out a different port than the port that that communication just came in on, it will be forwarded toward the proper destination out that alternate port. If, however, the destination is out the same port it came in on, it will just drop it because it's already on the right cable segment. And if it doesn't have knowledge of the destination at all, it will then perform flooding, which means it goes out all the ports because the switch doesn't know the destination, therefore it tries its best to support the communication by sending it out all the ports. Now, one other thing a switch can do is create a concept called a VLAN, a virtual LAN. A VLAN is a virtual network container that allows a switch to isolate communication within a VLAN and prevent it from communicating with outside entities. In fact, the VLAN is a recreation of a physical world concept called air gapping. But instead of not having cables at all, the switch itself implements an electronic management that will allow members of the same VLAN group to talk to each other without a problem, but talking between VLANs, at least initially, is prevented. So it's a way of controlling communications. Now, when we want to talk between VLANs, we do have to perform another function, and that function is called routing. Now, routing can be provided by 2 different computers, or 2 different types of network devices. One of them would be a level 3 switch, and any switch that's going to be routing for its own VLANs would need to be a level 3 switch to be able to accomplish that, or routing is performed by a router. Now, a router is a level 3 device as well. But a router's primary existence is to support communications between subnets. A subnet is a type of network container defined by IP addresses. It's in fact defined by 2 values: the IP address itself that is assigned to a computer system and an item called a subnet mask. These two concepts combined together defines the network neighborhood or the local area that all belongs to the same set of machines. It's kind of like having a street in a neighborhood. All the houses on the same street share the same street name in common. Therefore, all the devices in the same subnet have all the same subnet in common. Now, subnets, like VLANs, are network isolation tools or network segmentation tools. Members of the same subnet can talk to each other freely, but members of different subnets cannot talk initially. That is, unless a router is present to support the communication between the subnet. So, VLANs are a layer 2 network container. Subnets are a layer 3 network container. VLANs are created by switches. Subnets are created by IP address and subnet mask assignment. But in both cases, communication between VLANs or between subnets is supported by a router. So this gives you another perspective and more information on some of the more common concepts of network components and their related terminology.
In most computer systems, there are some basic commands you can use to gather information about the computer you're using and information about the network that you're currently connected to. Ultimately, this is how you can identify what resources may exist in the local network neighborhood. For example, we can open a command prompt and type in the command ipconfig on Windows, and this will show us our basic network state. Notice this useful information here. It shows you your local IP address, the subnet mask, and your default gateway. Now you can gather more information than this by using the ipconfig command with the command parameter switch called /all, which can display even more details about your network interface and its configuration. By scrolling back up into our Ethernet adapter, we can see a lot more about this than we saw before. We see details about its description. We see its physical address, also known as its MAC address. We also see that it is not DHCP enabled, thus it's being a statically assigned address. And we also see that we have our DNS address listed as well. So this is a basic information data set you can gather quite easily on any Windows computer, the command ipconfig. But we also have the netview command. The netview command is going to show you the list of devices that are connected to the same network. The output of this display shows you the net bias names or the device names of these machines located in the local network. You may be able to query these particular machines to access more information or gather more details about them, including resource access. And we can also run the command network statistics or netstat. Now, it can take a few moments sometimes for this information to populate, but once you see the result, you can see the active connections that are currently going on between my local machine and remote systems, that are here listed as foreign addresses. So these are just a few quick examples of some tools you can use in the native Windows environment to gather some initial local and some very basic networking information about your local network.